Okay, so I struggled, George, when I was thinking through how we're going to go through this interview. Like, obviously, if you and I were just truly talking to each other on this, we would have one conversation, but that might not be particularly illuminating to outsiders. So why don't I motivate it this way? A lot of where they're coming from is to say, look, it is simply not the case that a bank needs to have, it has to sit around and they want to make a loan, but darn it, they can't. They got to wait for some other depositors to first come in, put the money in the vault, and then they say, that's not true. The very act that the bank's assets and liabilities move up simultaneously. Checkmate, Selgin.
Yeah.
So you want to respond?
Okay, so the truth is there's a grain of truth to that criticism, but only a grain. And what you just described, the two alternatives you just described, that's what Cummeth and Jacob and Cummeth, that's what they compare in their model, right? The view where the bank can only lend more if he has to wait for people to bring their savings to it in the ordinary course of business. And then if it gets enough, it can lend more. Of course, that makes banks very passive in the lending process. And the other view is, no, they just write up all the loans they like because they don't really need to get any savings from anyone. Actually, neither of those views is correct. It's true that banks have to borrow in order to lend, but they don't have to wait to do that. Let me explain. A bank, first of all, a bank to make a loan, initially, all it has to do is say to the borrower, okay, we're going to credit your account by X. Let's say $1,000. Now, up to this point, you've created money and a loan, and you don't need anything as far as making that book entry is concerned. That's true. But hold on. When the borrower goes out and uses the funds, which is what borrowers do. They don't borrow money to leave the stuff at the bank. You're paying interest for what? To make the bank's balance sheet bigger? No. You're getting this loan so you can buy a house, or a businessman can buy some equipment or pay workers in advance of production and sales and so on. So the money gets spent. In a world with a lot of banks, it ends up getting deposited in all probability at some other bank. That bank sends the check or whatever the items are. Nowadays, it's mostly electronic transfers, but they get a message and this entitles them to make a claim on the bank that made the loan. And at that point, the bank that made the loan has to have something more than the printing press. It has to come up with real funds to settle with the other banks. And those real funds that it settles with, the stuff banks have to use to pay each other, is bank reserves, which only the Fed can create. They can't create those themselves. So that's where the limit comes in. Now, here's the thing. If a bank wants to make a loan, it sees what appears to be a profitable lending opportunity, which means it thinks that it can fund the loan for less than it can earn on it, right? The bank doesn't have to wait for people to come, for its ordinary retail customers to come and bring it some more money. It can borrow in other ways. Banks do this all the time. They can borrow on wholesale borrowing markets from other banks or from other institutions. So any bank that sees a loan prospect only has to ask itself one question. Can I make this loan and get the funding, if I don't already have some surplus funds on hand, for an interest rate that's going to be low enough to make the loan profitable? If the answer is yes, because they can get the necessary real funds from anywhere, it doesn't matter where, then they make the loan. So one thing is true. Banks don't have to wait for savings passively to come to them in order to make loans. But the thing that's not true is that they don't need to borrow from anyone at all in order to make those loans profitably. And that's where these two things are very different. The people thinking that they've shown that banks don't have to rely on savings at all in order to be lenders, because they don't have to wait for savings to come to them, are actually only looking at one possible source of savings. It is the most important. If you look at banks' balance sheets, they rely much more heavily on their retail deposits as a source of funding, at least they have for most of history, then on other sources like other banks or wholesale markets. They do rely on those other sources, but their retail deposits are actually their most stable and reliable and empirically important source of savings.
Okay, great. So folks, don't worry. This is going to be, what I'm about to do is the most technical I'm going to get. I can't, predict what George is going to do in the course of this interview, but this will be the hardest it will get, and then we'll make it more just words instead of numbers. But I think what you just said is critical, and let's just walk through to make sure, the listeners get what we're saying. And also, too, what we're saying here is not controversial. That's what's weird about this, George. And you kind of alluded to it earlier when you said the two types of responses you've received on your paper. That didn't surprise me because what I think's going on, just to sort of not keep people in suspense on the edge of their seat, I think there's large-scale agreement between you, me, and the average even MMT theorist who knows banking and how balance sheets work, about the mechanics of, when a bank makes a loan, here's what happens to their assets, here's the liabilities, if there's reserve requirements, this is how they're satisfied, blah, 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 blah. And even when you bring the Fed into it, if we're talking about the U.S., we actually all kind of agree on it. But then when we say, and so therefore, and then we start pontificating about what does that mean, that's when we say three different things, like you, me, and the average MMT person. So it's interesting.
It's just, that's right. And I wouldn't finger the MMTs as being particularly egregious in this discussion and debate. There are some aspects of the theory I'm criticizing that they subscribe to, or that are drawn from their body of work. But generally, this is a heterodox view, but not particularly an MMT view that I'm criticizing.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
I guess I've encountered it. It's just because we have our different lived experiences, George, where because I follow a lot of MMT people on Twitter, usually when I see someone making this type of point and citing the Bank of England, it's someone who's a fan of MMT. And that's why but fair enough. I agree. It's not merely MMT people who criticize what they think is the ILF model, let's say. Okay,
and the best of them are much sharper than the worst version of the banks create all the funding they need crowd.
True. Okay, so here's now the technical thing just to go through. So there's Alice owns a hardware store and she wants to get some more inventory and she's running low. And so she goes to her bank, the Acme Bank, and says, I want to borrow $1,000. If they had actual $1,000 in currency in the vault from other customers depositing it, they could, of course, so they would credit her checking account, her business checking account, $1,000. The bank's assets would go up by $1,000 IOU. She would sign a promissory note or something saying, I promise to pay back $1,000 plus 5% interest, 12 months from now for this loan. So the bank's balance sheet's fine. In other words, their liabilities and assets both went up.
Initially. Yes.
And so it's not like the bank's hurting its bottom line by granting a loan. And then, like I say, if they had $1,000 in cash, and then Alice goes and buys some inventory from Bob's nail manufacturer, and then he goes and deposits in his bank of boyhood. And so I'm trying to keep the A's and the B's constant, folks. Right. And so then that bank goes ahead and says to the first Acme Bank, yep, here, we have $1,000 claim on you. And they could just give them the $1,000, and then the $1,000 would just go from the one vault to the other. That'd be fine. And then the dust.
So that's right. Mm-hmm. What's happened in the example you just described is basically you started with a bank that had $1,000 in among its assets. It has $1,000 more in reserves than it needs.
Right.
And so what it's doing is it's trading those reserves for a loan. Initially, its balance sheet goes up because it creates the loans and it still has the reserves. What was her name?
Alice is the borrower.
Alice. When Alice goes and made her purchase and the check or whatever, it gets returned for settlement, then the bank's going to lose as many reserves as the loan it created, and its balance sheet will then be back to the overall size it was at originally, but with the loan taking the place of $1,000 loan taking the place of $1,000 in reserves. So that bank's fine. It's fine. It's perfectly profitable operation. But we assume that it could really fund the loan, beyond just writing it up in the first stage of the process, it could also fund it in the more fundamental sense of being able to redeem its claims, the claims it created when it made the loan, when the other bank, when the rival bank asks for them to be redeemed. And that's the funding it needs, is the funding to settle with that other bank.
Right.